Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic.
And hi, I'm Noah Millman. I'm a senior editor at The American Conservative. Hi,
Hi,
Connor.
it's good to talk to you again. And
Good to talk to you as well.
I have been writing a bunch about police abuses. There seems to be
Yes,
a
you
new
have.
YouTube video that goes viral every week of police officer somewhere. Sometimes it's tasing someone. In the most tragic cases, it's shooting someone who's unarmed. And and of course, there are a lot of these that don't go viral. Some of them on YouTube, some of them that happen
Right.
away from the cameras. There's actually just an unarmed homeless person that was shot and killed by the LAPD in my neighborhood, and I've been
In
yeah,
your
I mean,
neighborhood.
really just I could walk to where it happened in 10 minutes, and so
Wow.
yeah, it's all around, and I often wonder, if you go looking for these sorts of things on YouTube, as I have, you tend
hmm
to wonder what kind of skewed perception you're getting of how often this sort of thing happens, right? It
Or alternatively, sort of how often has it always happened, and is what's different now that with ubiquitous recording technology and the ability to communicate instantly to the entire universe, the sorts of frequency of these sorts of events is suddenly
Oh yeah,
manifest where previously it was
I
not.
think that's definitely true. I think that this definitely happened much more than anyone who wasn't poor and black and living in a neighborhood where it happened a lot imagine that it happened. Um, I
hmm
think though that uh, I'm constantly kind of
Well, but there is a policy question
yeah
there, right? I mean, there's a debate going on right now about, you know, is this the negative fallout of, broken windows? Is this a consequence of the militarization of the nation's police departments? Like, those are things that were not always
right.
true, right? They weren't true in the 80s when crime was much, much higher. They weren't true exactly in the 50s when crime was much, much lower, and deference to the police and was much, much higher. So um, uh, there is a question
Oh yeah.
of whether it's happening a lot more now than it used to, or whether we just know more about it now than we did. Um,
Yeah, I think that the time horizon is important. In other words, I would be surprised if it was happening radically more now than it was in the 2000s or in the 1990s. But the farther you go back,
yeah,
uh, the less clear it is because so many things have changed. The
right. No, if you go back to the 50s, or certainly if you go back to the 20s, right, you're dealing with an entirely different sort of mentality about the relationship of the police to society, and the relationship specifically about the African American community to the general citizenry. It's a
yeah,
different. You're not in the same world, in the same
and the
world.
police have certainly changed their attitudes too. Radley Balko wrote a wonderful book about the militarization of police and the kind of the
Right,
warrior mindset. And police
right,
training has, of course, changed over the years in ways that people don't know a ton about because for a lot of police departments, you go back to and ask for training material from the 1980s. Um, they don't
right.
have it, and whatever training material they had at the time, who knows what was the relationship between what was on paper and what was the kind of informal norm. So yeah, it's really tricky.
Right, right, right.
And one thing that I think we're both interested in is the response of the kind of conservative movement to these police shootings and the Black Lives Matter protest, and to Baltimore and to Ferguson. I wrote a
Right.
piece recently, basically saying that with some exceptions, the conservative movement as a whole, the typical movement conservative, I think, doesn't particularly care about police brutality. Certainly not as much as one might expect if you just looked on paper at their attitudes toward everything from, um, you
Right.
know, uh, they have a predisposition to thinking that public employees are going to misbehave and are worried about the state being overzealous and infringing on liberty in many ways, but but not this way. It seems not, um, you know, arguably the most oppressive bureaucracies in the United States right now are the very worst police departments. You look at like Albuquerque and
Right.
Baltimore.
So I mean, you come from an interesting place on this, and Balco is another person who comes from an interesting place on this, right? In that you can sort of define yourself as broadly, vaguely, sort of within the center right in terms of your past and present associations, right, and in terms and so forth, but you come from very much a libertarian and civil libertarian inflected side of that. And so part of, I guess, what you're asking is, like, there's an element of libertarian rhetoric in mainstream movement, quote unquote, conservative talk. Is, you're asking on some level, is that real? Or perhaps more like, does it mean the same thing to them as it does, as it would to
right.
you, right? I think it's an interesting question. I think it's a question that you can take all the way back to the founding of the Republic, right? It was Sam Johnson who commented wryly, why do we hear something to the effect of, why do we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes, right? Noticed that the faction that was most within the British Empire of the time, I didn't call it the Empire then, whatever, but within the larger British global sphere, that was most fierce in asserting its natural inherent rights and against the crown, against was the same people who had slavery as an essential prop of their
right.
economy. So I think part of what we may be seeing, and by the way, I don't think it's entirely true that nobody in the conservative world is reacting this way. I think you have a minority view that is inflected this way, that is reacting very much that way. The sort of what you might call the sort of Rand Paul faction within the conservative world, and then you have the majority, I would say, that is reacting in a different way. If you think of the fundamental question, is the question of sort of personal security and security of your property, right? That the function of the state is to make sure the law is obeyed, right? And to make sure that I, as a householder and property owner, can feel secure in my domicile, right? And if I am allowed to go about my business the way I choose, then the question of whether these widely publicized police abuses are a problem goes to the question of who's the I, right, in this sentence, right? Do you worry more, you as an individual person, with this political perspective, more about the police or more about criminals? If you worry more about the police, then this might be a real concern. Libertarians were, and mainstream conservatives, I should say, were up in arms about Waco.
Right, yeah.
Right? Were up in arms about Ruby Ridge, right? There have been, do get agitated when they think the police are going to take action against situations that, or I don't think it's purely a race-inflected thing, but situations where they say, that looks like me, I could see myself there, right? Do they say that with these situations, or do the people on the other end seem like, that they fall into the category of people I'm worried are going to be a threat to my property and person, and therefore the police are doing fundamentally the job they're supposed to be doing, just maybe a little overzealously?
Yeah, one frustration I have in this conversation is that the direction it often goes is someone like Rudy Giuliani will respond to this debate by saying, look at all of the murders my policing policy stopped from happening in New York. These happened in disproportionately African American neighborhoods, I saved X many black lives that wouldn't have been here otherwise, right? And that's the kind of Rudy Giuliani City Journal defense of the status quo. And if you read like Ross Douthat writing on this, right, he is a defender of broken windows policing, and I think that there's
a less fierce defender than Rudy Giuliani. I think he very much acknowledges the criticisms.
He's someone who thinks that broken windows policing is important, but is open to other reforms, right? And I understand where Ross is coming from, and if I were sitting in a room with him, I'm sure that I could nail down some kind of compromise, because it's not broken windows policing per se, right? That I'm objecting to, even though the argument always goes in that direction, and that's what we end up arguing about. The idea of a foot patrolman walking around the street and getting to know the neighborhood and knowing who the troublemakers are, and if kids are always standing on the corner of some elderly woman's house and intimidating her, and one of them flicks a cigarette and he writes him up for littering because he's keeping order in the neighborhood, right? There are strong arguments, I think, against policing every little infraction, and that gets to other debates about over-incarceration. But I think that there's a way in which we can set those debates aside and say these are important to have. On the other hand, what is going to happen if a police officer is clearly caught doing something egregious on camera? Are they going to be suspended with pay and then back on the street because their union is so powerful that nothing is ultimately going to happen? Is it conceivable that in a major American city you're going to have dozens and dozens of egregious brutality cases so that millions of dollars are paid out? And what do you do about that? And to me, those are the big questions that, I can accept a reasonable person arguing for broken windows policing. What I can't accept is treating all of these other issues as if they don't exist when they're right before us and happening flagrantly.
Right. Well, so a few things that one sort of could say. You can't. Right. There's a public choice question here. Right. You can't say on the one hand we want to the police to feel we're they have 100% public support and that they're funded at the level that is necessary to keep crime at an extremely low level, and have a whole politics that is oriented around the goal is always to drive crime down, right? Which is what I would say was the orientation of politics through certainly in the 90s, right? And has continued since then, even as crime has dropped very dramatically, right? You can't, practically speaking, really have that politics and also have a politics that says we're trying to root out the bad apples, the Serpico politics, right? Of we're going to focus on rooting out the bad apples and protecting people from police abuses and so forth, right? Because you need to mobilize a certain coalition to do one thing, you need to mobilize a different coalition to do the other thing. I think it's not that there's necessary trade-offs in the abstract, but I think there's necessary trade-offs in the real world.
Oh, there's definitely political trade-offs. And to me, that's frustrating because I think the actual policing policy, I would argue that the kinds of abuses that go on undermine good policing, right? The persistence of these abuses turns whole neighborhoods against cooperating with the police, against testifying in court, against juries believing the police when they testified that, this person perpetrated an assault or whatever. So, yeah.
Well, right, and I mean, if you read some of the stuff that's been written about the way Baltimore works, right, you'll see that, for example, the rate at which they clear murder cases has gone down dramatically, even as the number of murders has gone down dramatically, right? That the incentives in the city are lined up not around either clearly preventing or solving serious crimes exactly, right? They're oriented around, number of arrests and number of convictions and things like that. That statistics that are readily measurable. They obviously are also oriented around the overall crime rate, but there are a lot of factors, obviously, that affect that, demographic factors and economic factors and so forth. So at the margins, right, you can see how an incentive system that has a logic to it, right, can sort of spin out of control. I'm not an expert on this area, right, on policing, and one thing I want to come back to just is, when you started, you asked sort of where's the conservative movement on this, and why don't they see this as a sort of big government run amok, and I do think the answer is that it's not a perception of the government being too big, right? Or that it doesn't parse as how big is it, but is it fundamentally doing its job, right? This is a job that pretty much every conservative, any kind of conservative thinks needs to be done, right? And there is, I think, a real difficulty in getting somebody to say, yeah, it's doing its job, and doing it in a way that is problematic, and therefore, even at the risk of having it do its job a little bit less potentially, right? We should, understand, like, so I just think this is a difficult issue, I think, for a right-wing coalition to grab, just bottom line. And that's just sort of, the way, that's just sort of the way it is. That's why sometimes it's time for, a left-wing coalition to win, is sometimes a constellation of issues is serious enough that really only, or a right-wing coalition gets sort of dragged along for fear of losing to a left-wing coalition. But does that make sense?
Sort of, yeah. Well, I mean, one interesting thing, a lot of the pushback I got on the piece that I wrote, some of it was saying that, here are these writers on the right who do care about this issue, and I totally acknowledge that. In fact, I think I said in my original piece that there are these individuals that take this position, but if you look at overall, where is National Review on this? Overall, where is Heritage on this? Overall, that's kind of my point. But the other bit of pushback was basically you take a city like Baltimore, and it's been run by Democrats forever, right? And even at the state level right now, Democrats control the legislature, right? So when the mayor of Baltimore went and asked for certain policing reforms, they were actually knocked down at the state level by Democrats and Republicans in the state legislature. And so you read someone like Instapundit, who never fails to kind of needle the blue tribe when there's an opportunity to do so, with a pithy line.
It's his job,
right? And this is the kind of argument that a bunch of people are putting forward, and to me, it's like, well, there's an important truth here, right? And so when Kevin Williamson is writing in National Review and needling Democrats and saying, actually, this is on you and your party, I think that there's a huge element of truth there, right? That Democrats have failed to reform these policies, and insofar as there are Democrats out there shaking their fists at the right and saying it's your retrograde racist coalition that's responsible for all these problems, well, no, lots of.
Well, but I think that's
and there are those people, but I would say that my frustration is like these Democrats in these cities, right, are running on a conservative platform on law and order issues, right? They're like, it's not as if City Journal in New York City is looking at Democratic people on the city council who are for stop and frisk and shaking their fist at them. They're supporting them, right? You look all over the country, and of course you can find red jurisdictions where there are terrible police abuses, which is another response to this. But I would argue that it's a bipartisan problem, and as a matter of ideology, even when Democrats are doing it, they're embracing neoconservative and conservative arguments in the policies that they're putting forth in these areas.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that, and I think it's important. I think it's sort of a silly game to to play that particular game of
Right.
gotcha. I think the real question would be to ask when when there's a kind of naive approach to this question that says the sort of come and see the violence inherent in the system, and says by that um, see how the racist white people are beating up on black people, and the more sophisticated answer is the violence is inherent in the system, right? You have black cops working in a black run police department for black mayors in some of these situations,
and are just as brutal or more so
committing abuses, and we may be confusing ourselves by using a particular sort of language and talking about racism, right? As if the ideology is self-consciously about race, as opposed to the racial effects of a system and ideology that has a lot of reasons for being the way it is, reasons that need to be sort of taken into
account. I think prejudice is often a better word than racism here, because part of what's going on is that on this...
That still sort of puts it at the level of like what, sort of individual conscience or something, as opposed to sort of the structures of power.
Yeah, well, I
guess.
Yeah, I think that both things are going on. In other words, I think at the street level, and this applies to both racial prejudice and other kinds of prejudice too. If you take race out of it and you talk about a person who dresses a certain way in a certain neighborhood, and they dress the way that a disproportionate number of criminals dress. Maybe it's gang colors, right? Maybe it's a particular style of clothing. A typical police officer on that beat looks at someone dressed that way and to some degree ceases to treat them as an individual and treats them as what they read as, right? And this...
Well, inevitably, right? I mean, that's part of the shortcut that any human being uses, that the shortcut that everybody in the neighborhood uses to... They may have better shortcuts,
right,
so they may know people better, but by definition in a city particularly, like, there's a lot of people you
don't
know. And you need to read them somehow.
Yeah, and this is at its most problematic when the fact that African Americans in some of these urban areas commit crimes at a higher rate than other groups. It's still the case that the vast majority of them are not committing crimes, but police on the streets are stopping them, and the Fourth Amendment ought to be protecting them in these cases from not being treated as individuals, but it's not. Policies like stop and frisk are fabricating reasonable suspicion, probable cause, and throwing people up against walls dozens of times in a month, even though they're not doing anything ever.
Right. I mean, I guess so. Stop and frisk obviously was a very big issue in New York in the last, in the last election, and what, I mean, I had lots of conversations here with people around the dinner table about what, and there were very sharp generational and racial and other lines.
Yeah, I imagine.
In terms of how people instinctively responded to the question, and so I guess there's an element of individual, I guess you'd say, conscience on here, but I wouldn't. Prejudice makes it sound like the question sort of is posed in the person's mind as, how do I feel about these people or those people? And I think it frequently is more of a kind of, is there an instinctive identification, right? When you hear about this, do you immediately say, in your own mind, is that the way I should be treated, or do you immediately say, is that the way they should be treated? Do you understand what
totally.
I mean?
I think that's definitely true.
You can be a they without being somebody that I hate, right?
Yeah.
And you treat theys by definition different than you treat
absolutely
we's.
Yeah.
I want to put a plug in briefly for the magazine I write for doing some. They've had a couple of pieces by I'm trying to remember his name. I feel bad about this, but a guy who's on the ground in Baltimore, and sort of making a plea for paying attention to what people in Baltimore, people in Sandtown particularly, Matthew Loftus is his name, are saying and doing, and not and basically taking sort of the local seriously. And I think if you talk about varieties of conservative responses to this, right? There's a mainstream conservative response, which I would say is sort of instinctively law and order oriented, to defend those whose job it is to keep the peace, by which the peace, I would say, primarily means the peace for people who see themselves as on the right side of the law. And a principled libertarian or civil libertarian response, which the Conor Friedersdorf or Radley Balco or Rand Paul sort of kind of response to this, that sees it as a question of government power. There's also a what I think sort of the instinctive TAC, American Conservative style response, right, would be to see this as a question of sort of where authority lies, right, of the separation of authority from the community, right, and say, this is sort of an instinctive answer of sort of localism is the answer to everything, right, of, you want police who live in the neighborhood and walk the beat, and you don't want it to be militarized and so on and so forth, because you want it to be a community, and you want to listen to the community itself about that. And I think that's a very healthy instinctive response, but I was struck by that piece that Balco wrote, and I'm going to look it up because I'm trying to remember. On
Ferguson, you mean?
About what's that?
The one he wrote about Ferguson and the tickets that people were getting, how they would get swept into the court
yeah,
system.
there was a specific guy who
he had an auto body shop, and he would
exactly
he was trying to fix cars, and he would
part of what he pointed out was that and this is what really struck me in it, was that there are sort of structural economic reasons why a town like that, right, which is has a limited tax base, right, would be stuck relying substantially on fines and fees and so forth to get revenue. And so basically the policing strategy is to some extent dictated by the economic position of the town. And then that in turn has follow-on effects that sort of keep the town in a state of unable to sort of grow out of that kind of a strategy and that kind of a dependency. And even using police from outside the town has something to do with what the demographics of the town are, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a tough question for conservatives in a different way, because it points up that
absolutely
questions of distribution frequently get parsed, I think, both naively on the left and on the right as, oh, well, if so and so had more money, then he wouldn't be a criminal. Well, that's stupid, right? But the questions of distribution don't just relate to every individual's economic position. They relate to the position of corporate entities, right, like local governments and their ability to do their jobs.
Oh, and I think that I think it's a huge problem for conservatives that in sort of the same way that local government failed to protect people's rights during the Jim Crow era, so it goes again today during the era when we're kind of when YouTube is peeling back what some local police departments look like. And you can look at Baltimore, you can look at Albuquerque, you can look at Joe Arpaio in Arizona, and there's all these places where it would seem that to protect the constitutional rights of people, you need federal intervention. I do wonder if there's an opportunity in some places. I wonder if order on the block would be better kept by an unarmed church group walking around in bright vests than police in Baltimore, right? And I do think that there's a kind of local possibility there. But I think maybe by way of transition, I would say one last thing that strikes me about the policing debate. I think it maps onto the foreign policy debate.
I was thinking the same thing.
Right, and I think that the way in which this happens, and maybe you have a different thought, but what I was going to say is that there's this sense in which the right is unable to really get into the nitty-gritty in arguing about police and police misconduct and what to do about it, because there's a big part of the coalition that just wants to both venerate police no matter what, and that puts a big premium on just the way that we talk about police. It's verboten to it's verboten to criticize police officers in certain ways. It's verboten almost to assume that they are fallible individuals like anyone else and just as prone to corruption as, say, a school teacher, right? Like, on the left, you're not allowed to talk about school teachers in certain ways, and on the right, you're not allowed to talk about police officers in certain ways. And of course, the same thing applies to the military and, in a bigger sense, America's role in the world, whether it's exceptional, whether our soldiers are capable of committing war crimes, all these sort of mental things about, like, how open are we to imagining that terrible things are being done? Not by all of these people. Of course, there are many wonderful police officers, many wonderful soldiers, but...
well, I think these would be concerns even if you believed, and I think there's reason to believe, that that the average character and moral stamina of a police officer or a soldier is exceptionally high, right? Because the situations that they're put in are also exceptionally stressful, and the power dynamics are exceptionally dangerous, right? So you could have somebody, you could say, your average American soldier is 10 times, 1/10 as many outright corrupt and dangerous people in the military as in the population at large. That would still turn out to be potentially a dangerous situation. I don't think you can have an army, no matter how well trained or how well selected, where you don't have to worry about abuses of power, and I think the same thing is true of a police force. We should see it as a structural thing, and not and that may be able to some. I hope, I wish, to cut this question of identification. Are these our people or are these their people, and whose side do we need to take?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because that feels like so much of the dynamic in both cases.